And formally say welcome everyone to our weekly call. It's great to have you on. Sort of middle of April already. Not sure how that happened, but there you are. Okay, to share my screen or share my slides just momentarily. Yeah, so just a quick reminder of the call. So the main theme for the call today, we're going to talk about the sort of NIS2 directive, the European Union NIS2 directive again. Emily Taylor, who many of you will know, she's been on this call numerous times previously, sort of founder of the DNS Research Federation, has joined us, and he's going to talk about some of the sort of latest data on the sort of transposition of the NIS2 directive into national legislation across the EU member states. And he's also going to talk a little bit about know your customer research, which is one of the important elements of NIS2 as it applies to the sort of DNS ecosystem. But Emily will explain that a little more in a bit. And then we sort of touch on actually, I missed out a heading there. I just realised some of the recent sort of developments in terms of news headlines, of which many this week. So I'm just going to cherry pick some of the most interesting ones just to highlight those. And a reminder, as always, those of you on the weekly headlines mailing list would have received those this morning, European time. If you didn't and want to be added to the mailing list, just pop me an email and I'll send that to you. But as I say, I just talk through some of the highlights. And then as always, we sort of just also highlight some of the sort of events coming up in the very near term, what we're going to cover on the call in the next couple of weeks, and time permitting, any other business. So that's the plan for the call today. But as I say, the main theme being Emily and the NIS2 directive, which I think is really important, as it's about 6 months roughly since the directive came into force, at least in theory. So really looking forward, Emily, to your update on how things are moving into the member state sort of national legislation, and also the know your customer aspects as well. So without further ado, Emily, welcome to the call again. Over to you.
Andrew, thank you very much for inviting me to this call this week. Delighted to be here again and to share some of our research findings with you all. I will just share my screen. Hopefully, you can see my slides.
Yep.
I'll try and open the chat as well, maybe, or Andrew, you can just interrupt me if there's any questions, but also just to members of the audience, if anything's unclear and you'd like me to answer a question during the presentation, please just go ahead and raise your hand or ask for the floor. So I'm going to be talking about the background to the NIS2 directive, the second directive from the European Union on network information security, and how it intersects with the world of domain names. We've been tracking transposition, and I'll talk about what that means. So I'll be talking about how the countries are doing in making this into their national law, and the sort of the trends of approach that we see, which we call the Goldilocks effect. And I'll explain about that. There's some guidance from the NIS2 Cooperation Group, a group of experts on the elements that relate to domain names. And then the final part of the talk, as Andrew indicated, will be looking at some research we've been doing on Know Your Customer across different industries, and asking what we can learn. Okay, so here's an explainer, and right up front, I have to apologise for how wordy these slides are, but I'll try and keep it as light as any talk on the law and domain names can be. But the NIS2 directive, as I say, the second directive from the European Union on network information security, was adopted in late 2022. But as Andrew said, the key date has passed about 6 months ago, which was the deadline by which the member states had to transpose that directive into national law. Just a kind of a quick aside show, there are two real types of European laws. There's a regulation, such as the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. And the significance of the regulation word is it goes straight into the member state's law without any further work being needed. So it's passed by the European Union, and then straight away it has direct effect into the legislation of the member states. Directives are different. They are a lighter touch instrument, and they require each member state to adopt a domestic law. And the idea is that the directive will set a sort of baseline for each member state to meet. And that means that if they already feel they meet the baseline, they might not even have to do anything, or they can, they can pick and choose. And we're seeing a lot of different approaches at the national law. So what has NIS2 got to do with domain names? There's Article 28 and a few other provisions, but Article 28 is the real important one, which sets out a set of obligations relating to registration data for domain names. It affects registries, which operate top-level domains, and quotes entities providing domain name registration data. This is a defined term, meaning registrars, agents on behalf of registrars, such as privacy and proxy registration service providers, or resellers. It's a big question, who are these entities? And that's something that we're attempting to solve this year with our ecosystem discovery project. So these entities are caught by Article 28, and they are required to both collect and maintain accurate and complete domain name registration data consistent with data protection law. The article sets out what the necessary information is, so none of it is particularly unexpected, but also that the article and the directive itself has extraterritorial effect. And when you actually dig into the terms that cover the domain name industry throughout the NIS2 directive, it really seems like the legislators thought very carefully about how they were going to make sure these laws affected the entire domain name industry, no matter where they were located, if they're providing services to EU customers. So that extraterritorial effect we're going to come back to a little bit later in the talk. And so part of the obligations to have accurate domain name registration data comes with it a requirement for verification procedures to ensure accuracy. Now, Andrew, in his preamble, mentioned the requirement, that know your customer is really talked about in the context of NIS2. It's not actually specifically called out in the Article 28, but it does get a mention in the recitals. They don't have legal force, but they are there for interpretation. As well as the maintenance and collection of this registration data, there's also a requirement for these providers in the domain name industry to disclose that information to, quote, legitimate access seekers. And then finally, Article 28 provides at subsection 6 non-duplication and cooperation. So recognizing that the domain name industry operates at quite a distributed level, so you might have resellers reselling on behalf of registrars who are in turn registering at registries. You've got a chain of actors who are involved in domain name registration. And there's wording that suggests that there should be non-duplication and cooperation between these parties. So, does that mean that the NIS2 is law? No. As I explained, it's a directive, it's not a regulation, and that means every member state has to make its own law, and the deadline passed 6 months ago. So how are we doing? Well, TLDR, most of the member states are being sued by the Commission for being late. 23 out of 27 of the member states didn't make it in time. But I have to say, most of them have done something, and actually passing this legislation is not a sort of simple thing. Don't forget, most democracies last year in 2024 held elections, so that would have delayed things. But usually what we're seeing is that the member states will have at least one, if not two, consultation periods. We're seeing three distinct approaches on Article 28, which I'll go into in a minute. And the Article 28.6, the bit about non-duplication and cooperation, seems to be a key area of debate, which will no doubt lead to implications and costs as we go forward. And looking ahead, and this is a summary of an excellent blog written by Harriet Moynihan for us. She is an internationally recognised legal scholar, and she thinks that there's a risk of forum shopping as a result of uneven transposition, implementation and application of the rules. And also, given the extraterritorial effect of NIS2, this will impact providers both inside and outside the EU. So what do we mean by the Goldilocks effect? Well, so in roughly equal proportions, the member states seem to have gone for a Article 28 plus, a sort of too big maybe approach, or certainly it embellishes Article 28 by adding guidance. In the case of the Czech Republic, it provides for criminal offences for the breach of Article 28 at $2 million equivalent per offence. And then some member states have gone for the too little approach, where you're either not mentioning Article 28 at all, omitting Article 28.6 in some cases, or just doing something that's not quite getting there in terms of the wording. And then in the middle, the sort of just right approach, many of the member states are just translating it faithfully into their local law. So given this variance, it's quite helpful to have guidance on how to implement Article 28, which has been provided last year by the NIS2 Cooperation Group, a group of national experts and representatives who are convened by the European Commission. And many of those, for those of you familiar with the ICANN environment, many of those representatives do sit on the GAC at ICANN, and it's pretty clear from reading the guidance that they do understand the registration of domain names quite well, and also that they understand the sensitivities of the different points on the spectrum, if you like, of the different stakeholders affected by Article 28. So the aim for this guidance is to sort of smooth out those inconsistencies that we're seeing in the national law. It's not legally binding, but it is actually advisory guidance. But there's just very helpful sort of practical approach. So they're saying, look, for emails and telephone numbers, syntactic validation is going to be fine. That means just take just make sure that if it's a number field, it will accept a number and not war and peace. And also that these are operationally verified. So there's a little feedback loop involved in it. But also their advice is to take a risk-based approach to verification of the registrant name at registration and renewal. So that's also, you don't have to go right the way through your stock to be compliant. You just have to be to be getting to the domain names at the point of refreshing, if you like, at renewal or new registrations. And a risk-based approach is fine, so you don't have to implement all these checks for absolutely everything. But there is a sort of sense that they might take account of state-of-the-art predictive algorithms on verification. And on the issue of legitimate access seekers, so who do you provide this data to? They actually, I think they duck the issue. No, I don't know if there's any members of the group on this call, but that the most people agree that law enforcement should be provided with this data by registries and registrars. But there's a range of opinions about whether those enforcing intellectual property rights could be classified as legitimate access seekers. And that reflects quite a polarized dialogue within the ICANN environment between the domain name industry and intellectual property rights enforcers. And the cooperation group kind of duck the issue by saying it's optional whether or not you decide to recognise IP rights enforcers as legitimate access seekers. And if a DNS provider does refuse to provide access, they do have to include their reasons as to why not. So what's happened this year since the transposition deadline has passed? There's still progress, but by the end of 2024, only 5 member states had got across the line. But as you see here, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary have made progress. Hungary was actually, we thought, the first member state to have transposed the law, but and unfortunately the Commission decided they didn't do it well enough. And true enough, when we looked at the law, we couldn't find any trace of Article 28. But we haven't been able to find any progress on Latvia. That was also previously marked as transposed, but they did get sued by the Commission as well. So if anyone's got any updates on what's happening in Latvia, please let me know. If you're interested in tracking Article 28 transposition, do have a look at our tracker on our website. Each of these lines can open up and you can get a really nice view of exactly what's going on at the different phases. We've had to roll back the statuses on several of them as they ended up getting sued by the Commission, but we're really trying to keep it as updated as possible. It's not an easy thing to do, because it involves like manually going and visiting the websites and trying to grapple with laws prepared in all of the member state languages.
Emily, just
Yes.
can I interrupt a second? So, question from Andreas in the chat, which I think I can work out the answer to, but just for completeness, when you put your Goldilocks slide up, you didn't list every member state, and I'll take Andreas's word for it in his question that he didn't see Germany or Spain, for example, there. So I think I'm right in saying your tracker does cover all the member states, doesn't it? Even though the slides obviously were summarised.
Yeah, the slides are summarised. Thank you very much for the question, Andreas. Yes, the tracker covers every member state, and you can visit it and have a look. I've got the references at the end. Now, from memory, and I may be wrong on this, I don't think either Germany or Spain have completed their transposition journey yet, but we have got the draft laws up there. We've sort of tried to capture where they're at the moment. But this is a rapidly changing picture. But so thanks a lot for pointing that out and for that question, Andreas. Okay, so I shall move on to our Know Your Customer research and look forward to further discussions with you on this. So given that verification of registrant data seems to be part of the matrix of implementing this new law, we thought, well, let's have a look at other industries and see what they're doing. Because in the domain industry, there's long been a dialogue within the ICANN community and elsewhere about whether I know your customer should be adopted, whether it would be effective if it was, is quite a controversial issue within the domain industries. So what did we do? We looked at other industries, and partly, because they have an online element, all of them, and also because there's a range of approaches. So in the finance industry, obviously an incredibly heavily regulated industry, subject to all sorts of laws. They do apply Know Your Customer because they have to. We wanted to understand what they were doing. The crypto industry, an emerging industry, there is some regulation. There's also lots of gaps in regulation. It's also, if I can make a crude generalization, it's it's got a reputation as a sort of environment as being quite used and abused by criminality. So it's sort of interesting to reflect on what has been the impact of Know Your Customer in terms of cleaning up the crypto industry. And then finally, the dating industry was really interesting because that seems to be almost completely a voluntary adoption of Know Your Customer. And it was interesting to reflect on why the dating industry adopted these measures and what impact they had. Oh, Andrew, I can see there's a, a chat. Oh, right. Oh,
Oh yeah.
Kurt, you just answered on the position in Germany. Thank you very much. Okay, so what did we find out? We've got a blog on each of these, so I've given the reference to that at the end. But basically, in the finance industry, a whole load of regulations apply, and they take Know Your Customer seriously, requiring government issued ID, proof of address, sometimes biometrics at the point of opening an account. But also, there's that sort of ongoing monitoring and due diligence. What sort of behaviours are you exhibiting as an account holder? Does this make your business or personal account look legitimate or otherwise? But also, of course, I'm sure all of us are familiar with the phone call from the bank when you make a payment from a different place to a new person. There's a lot of behavioral analysis and anomaly detection. And so, in a way, that the Know Your Customer is really not just a point in time at account creation, but something that lives with you throughout your life as a customer of that bank. Crypto, an emerging industry, there is some anti-money laundering regulation that requires know your customer. In some jurisdictions, cryptos are treated as securities, and so that comes with it a raft of regulation, but not everybody's on board. There's decentralized exchanges, ATMs, and so on, which are outside of the regs. But passport verification is normal when you're setting up a wallet. But despite this, there are still issues with the crypto environment, as many of you will be aware. So that tells us that Know Your Customer, it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to completely eliminate criminality. And actually, one of the things that was striking, sorry, I've just managed to do this, was that it was very hard to come across evidence during our research that of what the difference Know Your Customer made when it was implemented. So any stories, even anecdotes that people have about that impact would be really great to hear. And finally, on dating, at registration, there's sometimes verifying identity with, government ID, but actually speaking to representatives in the dating industry, they're actually like not that bothered if your profile doesn't match your government ID. The important thing is that your picture should match you. So they do a lot more checking with selfies or liveness detections, and there's quite a lot of biometrics, and there's quite a lot of anti-AI avoidance techniques that are going on. But there's also, again, as with banking, when using the app, a lot of monitoring, a lot of looking for anomalies, and also response to reports of suspicious activity, fake profiles, catfishing, and whatever. So
Before
where
Emily, sorry,
yes,
just before
go
you
ahead.
move on, Michael raised his hand. I don't think it was to do with dating. I think it was possibly crypto, but he
Yeah,
can sort of
go
tell us.
ahead, Michael.
Well,
Hello,
I
nice
am
to see
looking to get into a new relationship with a new registrar,
you.
so I am concerned about being catfished. But actually, something you said to me tweaked a thing, which was the know your customer and the banks and the increased use of various 2FAs to update transactions and stuff like this. And my impression, at least in Canada, is that the banks have jumped onto some kind of a really terrible AI bandwagon. Um, and they've basically thrown out all their old behavioral analysis stuff in, pursuit of, I think, snake oil, because they're doing stuff, in my opinion, that is just counterproductive. And I'm wondering, and then you talked about dating, and I thought that was very interesting. But I'm wondering if you think that that is going to be our registry is going to be going out and being forced to buy third party mechanisms to do behavioral analysis, or that just doesn't fit into domain registration at all. Um,
Yeah, great
yeah.
points, Michael. And as you know, I think actually a lot of the banks and finance industry have been using AI in the background for many, many, many years to detect anomalies, and that's been working pretty well and quite in an advanced way. But of course, there is an awful lot of AI-ness around at the moment, and I'm interested in your observation. I think the
Well, it used to be that if your credit card company knew you bought a plane ticket to Norway, they wouldn't be surprised when you did transactions in Oslo,
yeah,
right? And there was a real connection there. And my impression over the last 2 or 3 years is that all that, you called it AI, but I'm going to call it behavioral analysis because I think that's actually not
mm,
AI.
mm,
My impression is if they've thrown it all away, like
how
they've thrown
interesting.
20 years of stuff away in favor of the latest trendy doodad that doesn't actually work well.
Yeah.
And so I'm actually concerned that some of the checks registrars might do today, they're going to kind of be forced to normalize and wind up with snake oil.
Yeah,
Do you think that's possible, or?
well, what I think is very possible, Michael, is that um, particularly in the registrar industry where margins are incredibly tight, that the providers will end up adopting a third party um, know your customer provider and actually end up inheriting a lot of their requirements rather than sort of tracing back to the legal requirements. And so that's an interesting sort of it's also of course for legitimate access seekers it will add another degree of indirection in terms of who holds the data and who has actually been responsible for verifying it. Um, it's really interesting listening to so I went to a talk by Meta at a recent Global Anti-Scam Summit, and they were talking about all the work that they've been doing to implement Know Your Customer in certain advertising relationships, and it's clear that they put a huge amount of of investment into those technologies, which is probably not that possible. Um, so I can see the chat lighting up. I also see something from Georgia. Oh, hello, Georgia. Nice to nice to hear from you. I've actually just lost your comment, but we can throw open the floor in a minute. So I don't know what's going to happen, but Michael, the last kind of point of your question is that you know, I think you're right. The relationship between registries and registrars versus an app, a dating app, a bank, something like that, it's so different. It's much more transactional. It's much more focused at the point of registration. So unless you're also, as a registrar, involved in hosting somebody's material or providing them with email services, you're not really going to have the opportunity to monitor their behavior very much and find those anomalies. So I've just got a couple of more points and then go to questions, Andrew, if there's time. So looking at the people, the registries who are at the top of our league table in terms of managing down their abuse, we consistently see Norway and Denmark towards the top of the list, and both of those happen to require national IDs in their registration. Now, and speaking to some of the registries, they didn't necessarily make those requirements in order to manage down abuse. It was a sort of a happy consequence of that. And also, I would say that most of these TLDs and registries in the centre community do a wide range of activities. It's not just focused on Know Your Customer. So, what did we learn? In terms of NIS2, transposition is delayed, but actually most of the member states are well underway with their journey. There is inconsistency at the member state level, and combined with extraterritoriality, I think we will see forum shopping. There are different member states that have, different approaches. Like, for example, we've had some discussion about Germany, Romania, traditionally very strong on privacy and with major constitutional protections on privacy. Would that be an attractive jurisdiction in which to challenge on privacy type of grounds? Likewise, Belgium might well be more law enforcement friendly in terms of its implementation of Article 28. So you can see lots of interesting things will come out of this. We're still trying to discover who's affected by NIS2, so watch this space. But longer term, I think inconsistent approaches at the member state level usually compels the Commission to revisit regulation, usually with a sort of a community-wide approach. So it tends to lead to more intervention rather than less. Learning from Know Your Customer in other industries, and it's great to have Georgia on the call because she led this research. Know Your Customer, not a silver bullet, but it's not that controversial either. And it was something that the two of us discussed a lot during the research period, is that a lot of there's a real kind of heat around this issue in the domain name industry. But in other industries, they're like, yeah, we do know your customer, but yeah, and then we do other stuff as well. As we discussed, there's quite a difference between app providers, walled gardens, and domains, where there isn't really that much of a relationship between the provider and their customer. But it is also true to say that the top performing TLDs who do manage down their abuse successfully do use verification alongside other techniques. And there at the end of the slides, I've included a bunch of references for you. They're all to our own research, and those, of course, in turn have many other references in. So I will stop sharing then and look forward to your comments and questions.
Brilliant, thanks, Emily. I'll just quickly run through some of the things in the chat and then see if anyone wants to then pose further comments or questions. So from the chat, well, thanks, Kurt, for posting a link to the transposition of the at least the draft legislation in Germany. So that's there. That's useful. I think reading through the lines of Alex's comment, it looks like the implementation may be further advanced in Finland than possibly Emily. Your list is currently captured, so that's maybe some homework afterwards to compare and contrast. I don't expect you to comment live as to whether that's
well. And all I can say is, Alexi, thank you very much. We're doing this manually, and we really appreciate tip-offs like that, because it's great to have that kind of intel from the community. So thank you very much, and I'll pass that on to our researcher.
a question from Georgia, whether there was any research at all into third parties?
We've done a little bit, Georgia. We haven't published anything at the moment, but it's something that we definitely wanted to look at. I think I want to look at it in terms of what the domain name industry is implementing and to how that. But Georgia, if you've got your microphone, I know that you looked at some of the third-party providers such as Yoti, and maybe you'd like to add something on this.
Hi, Emily. Nice to see you. I won't comment on the third parties at the moment, but I was just curious because it's always an interesting point to look at, and also considering some of the comments made about banking, just looking to see whether there was any research being done into the effectiveness of the third parties, really, in Know Your Customer. But yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thanks. We had a panel the other day. Andrew, you came along to it as well, and actually there was a speaker there from CIFAS who is reflecting on Know Your Customer in the sort of financial world, and just saying that you tighten up protections in one area, and it leads to a sort of cottage industry in fake IDs and so on. So it's sort of like not something that when you implement Know Your Customer, you're done, and that's you've solved all criminality on your platform. You're probably often driving people to sort of to different behaviours, including to fake IDs as well.
Thanks, Georgia. Michael's made a comment which I think summarises some scepticism as to some of the Know Your Customer processes by his bank, versus some more positive comments by looking from his registrar, which is good to know. Let's see. I think Kurt put some comments about this too being a good in principle, but some of the implementations make it maybe unnecessarily complex and confusing. And a question from Michael, and by all means, anyone that I've tried to sort of paraphrase your comments, feel free to sort of come on and expand as appropriate. But Michael Richardson, has added a comment, a question at the end. Is there a role for governments to act as third parties? And this is reference sort of digital ID, wallets, driver's license, and selective disclosure. So I don't know if you want to comment on that one specifically, Emily, if you have any thoughts on it.
I mean, to Kurt's point of view, I think that in a way, given that Know Your Customer is quite widespread across most industries where you create an identity, if you like, or you create an asset that can then be used online, obviously mostly legitimately, but sometimes to defraud people or to cause problems, then in a way the domain industry was probably due some kind of an intervention. But I agree with you. I think we're already seeing a huge amount of variation in the implementation. And we know that sort of lack of consistency tends to cause, as you say, complexity, confusion, cost. So I think that we'll be, unfortunately, on this roller coaster for some time to come. Michael, if I understand you correctly, are you saying, is there a role for governments to sort of, do you mean to verify people's identities and so on?
The first thought I had is you said that the registrar world is such low margin that they're likely to they're going to want to outsource this to the lowest bidder, and so the question is, well, maybe if governments have specific things they want, maybe they should be that lowest bidder there, which kind of also makes it easier for them to say, I complied to your legislation because I did whatever you told me, right?
I did your stuff. Yeah,
I did your stuff.
Yeah.
And part of that may also be the move towards wallets and things with the selective disclosure. Maybe that all just whirls together. I don't know if that satisfies the Know Your Customer.
Yeah, I think one thought that your question sparks in me is like in, say, Denmark, in Estonia, where there are digital identities quite well embedded in those societies. In Denmark, for example, they have adopted that as part of the domain registration process. So there is a kind of an indirect role of government there of supporting a digital identity and that getting absorbed into the workflows of domain registries in some cases. But it is also interesting to reflect that the abuse rates in Denmark really low, but in Estonia, where there is also a very widespread digital ID in practice, the Estonian registry is kind of middling in terms of its performance, certainly among the European TLDs. But that's, you know, there's a very high bar. They're all pretty good. Michael, you have your hand up.
Yes, Emily. So,
Hello.
sorry, joined a little late. One of the questions that I wanted to follow up perhaps on the last question about the race to the bottom. I think one of the important things to look at NIS2 is not only Article 28, but Article 21 that deals with supply chain. And while Article 28 deals with the obligations to registration authorities, registries, registrars, resellers, Article 21 actually imposes those obligations on the registry operator. So I think registries need to think very carefully before outsourcing because under again paragraph 2D of Article 21 with supply chain, I don't think outsourcing to the lowest common denominator would uh be in the letter and spirit of Article 21. So I think you always need to look at Article 21 and 28 together when talking about this subject.
Yeah,
Thanks.
great. Thank you very much for raising that, Michael. And you and I've discussed this before, haven't we? And it's certainly coming up in conversations with affected parties in the domain industry. Is that they're when they're thinking about their NIS2 compliance, they're also thinking about Article 21, and that actually, of course, brings in the kind of wider scope of the NIS2 as a network information security instrument. So it's not just your supply chain in domain registration, but it's your supply chain right across your business. So a very substantial obligation to try to raise the bar of general cybersecurity. And I think I'm right, aren't I, Michael, that Article 21 pulls in turnover-based fines. Article 28 doesn't actually state what the sanctions are for breach. I mean, we saw that the Czech Republic have gone out there and created criminal offences and fines, but that's not really the norm. Whereas actually, my understanding is Article 21 does create sanctions, turnover-based type of sanctions.
Yeah, correct, Emily. Under NIS2, I think it's only Article 20 and 21 that actually have the mandatory fine. So that to me, much like the GDPR mandatory fines had if you will, got the attention of the domain name industry. I do think the mandatory fines set forth in Article 20 and 21 should require equal heightened concern. My opinion.
Yeah, thanks a lot for raising it, Michael.
Good questions. Right, I'm just keeping an eye on the time, but wanted to check, did anyone have any last comment or question? Now will be a good time. I see, Eric. Can registrars or registries have fewer obligations under NIS2 if they collect less data from customers when they register?
Thank you very much for the question. Unclear, I would say, because you could possibly try to rely on the non-duplication wording in Article 28.6. But as I hope I mentioned in my presentation, Article 28.6 is the one where there is most variation across the member states. So combining that with the extraterritorial effect of NIS2 might mean that you might be safe-ish in one jurisdiction, but you might not be that safe in another. And we're predicting quite a lot of forum shopping afterwards. So Article 28.6 seems to allow for non-duplication. So if you've got your supply chain, say, of reseller, registrar, registry, then you could maybe go, well, actually, our deal between us is that so-and-so collects the data and the rest of us don't need it. And it's definitely the case. I mean, look at the thin registries in the G space. You don't need the registration data to operate a zone file. However, if you've got a legal obligation to collect and maintain that registration data, I think we will find out in time what the implications of Article 28.6 are. There's not really much clear guidance even from the NIS2 Cooperation Group, if I'm correct on that.
Excellent. Right, last question or comment, Michael.
Yeah.
If it's your current hand. Yep.
Yep. Just to follow up on Emily's comment there, I agree. The cooperation group has not provided a specific opinion on whether registries need to be thick or thin, but this is where I think Article 21 comes back into play. So if a registry says, I want to be thin, and that is clearly the growing trend, that does not necessarily alleviate them from obligations. And I think the best reference point, Emily, is to look at how VeriSign, which has operated .com as a thin registry since its existence, how they actually comply with the Chinese real name verification. So they actually have an external pointer to the verified contact. So I think for those that are interested, the VeriSign RCEP on how a registry that is thin could still comply with registrant verifications is something to look at. And again, this is why I think this loops back into Article 21 from a supply chain perspective.
So it's complicated, I think, would be the summation of that's helpful, Michael. I see that's prompted some comments, which I think we won't have time to go into, about sort of thick versus thin registries, which I know was a subject of discussion in the ICANN community, or has been for some while. Amongst other things, and Kurt has posed a question which may be a topic we should perhaps look to revisit at another time, because I don't think it lends itself to an easy or simple sort of quick answer, which is sort of thrown that sort of hand grenade across the table about whether NIS2 collides in some way with the Cyber Resilience Act. Which I think discuss post call, but maybe we'll come back to that, because I think that could be quite an interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a even more generalised point actually, Kurt, which is, I believe on somebody, not me, somebody counted up that there's 116 pieces of European Union legislation relating to the digital sector. There is an awful lot. Very difficult to maintain consistency, I would say, across such a large number of legislative instruments. So, yeah, I think one of the challenges of implementation and compliance with any of these pieces of legislation is to also be compliant with all the other ones at the same time. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Right, let's pause there. I think this is a sort of something which will run for some while, not least of which as the transposition exercise continues in any case. But I guess one of the key links for people to look at in the slides, which we can sort of circulate afterwards, hopefully, will be the link to the transposition sort of summary, just to try and keep tabs on where things are at. So hopefully that will gradually turn more green over the coming months, assuming governments aren't totally distracted by other events in other places, which is, I suppose, a distinct possibility at the moment. But thank you, Emily, for that. That was really helpful, as always. I'm going to, and you're welcome to stay on, of course, or to not if you're sort of busy diary. I'm just going to very briefly cover a couple of other things because there's been a lot of stuff happening over the last week or so. Quite a busy industry. So let me, and as I mentioned at the start, I'm going to try and give the key ones, but I'm not going to go into any detail because we really won't have time, and there's a lot. Just as I say, I'm going to call out the key ones and happy to share. Well, you'll get the slides post call if you don't have the weekly headlines email anyway. But first thing, it's 40 years to the month since .com became a thing. With symbolics.com. And I seem to recall at the time a lot of academics were outraged at the idea of a commercial domain, and there were lots of strongly held opinions about that. But there you are. That was then, this is now. And a nice write-up by VeriSign on that. Moving on, you may have seen from NIST an update to their document covering secure domain name system deployment guide, co-authored by Scott Rose of NIST plus Cricket and also Ross, both from Infoblox. I think Ross is, yes, he is on the call. So grand job, Ross. Good to see that coming out. And the draft is open for comment because it is a draft currently. It's so important to emphasise. Open for comment until towards the end of next month. And we're just sort of in discussion to see if we can schedule a call in the next couple of weeks to sort of cover some of the key elements of the draft. But the main thing being it covers, amongst other things, encrypted DNS, which the previous version obviously preceded that being a thing, so obviously it wasn't in there. So it sort of significantly updates the previous version. Also, completely different topic, but Sidon Labs have been sort of pushing for the formation of a new working group, which met, IETF working group this is, which eventually met for the first time in Bangkok at the last IETF meeting. The RESTful provisioning protocol, which looks at basically it aims to provide a more scalable, better integrated alternative to EPP. So this is very much in the registrar space, but important part nevertheless of the DNS ecosystem. So I missed that earlier, so I wanted to just highlight that was now a thing. So now a number of you on the call do work in that space. I think there's another handful, so I'll go quickly on these. Excellent post on whether DNS abuse mitigation efforts are keeping up from the sort of DNS Research Federation. So this team have been busy on a number of topics. Just looking at with the sort of the introduction of some additional measures in ICANN's sort of TLD contracts, I think last year, whether that's starting to make an impact. And I think the short version is, still more is needed to be done. But good, it's a really interesting post, so read that. Since NIST 2 is a topic of conversation, Emily, I think, also mentioned that there was a blog post on the topic, and that's the link there, the sort of third from the screen. One you may not have seen, an academic paper looking at DNS over QUIC and also QUIC itself to see whether it's vulnerable, or they are vulnerable to website fingerprinting attacks. So that you can identify which websites users are going to, even though obviously their traffic's encrypted. And from a quick read of the paper, the short answer is it seems that there is a potential vulnerability there. But again, have a look at the paper. It's an interesting read. And I think that was probably all the things I'd highlighted, apart from the one at the very bottom of this last screen, which is the UK IGF has got an online session coming up later this month to try and get the meeting in prior to the sort of global IGF meeting in Oslo in June, all part of gathering views as part of the WSIS plus 20 review. So those of you more orientated towards the policy side, you may find that interesting. It's easy to join remotely, so it doesn't matter if you're not in the UK for that. And then other stuff well away from the DNS space, but a couple of things to mention. There's an interesting report as to suggesting that AI hallucinated code dependencies could become a new supply chain risk. And also a short blog post on the AI preferences working group, again, newly formed working group in the ITF, which met, had an interim meeting in Brussels over a couple of days last week. It did meet in Bangkok, but its first substantive session was really in Brussels last week. And then just mindful of the time, plenty of other stuff coming up. I just highlight that it's on the slide, the sort of link to comments on the NIST paper that I mentioned earlier. So you provide comments by email to that email address, should you have any. And then in terms of things coming up, a whole host of meetings, conferences over the next couple of months. I've highlighted a few that I'll be at. So if you're in San Francisco in a couple of weeks, drop me a line. It'd be good to meet up in person, as David and the Atom Networks team have already done. Or if you're in Lisbon for the RIPE meeting, or London for the IPRI meeting, both of which are in the middle of May. Let me know. And then next week, the other thing I want to say, I'd completely missed this. I'd forgotten it was Easter Monday next week, so we won't have a call next week, because I know that's a public holiday in many countries. So do bear that in mind. No call next week. A week after, we'll just take a look at the RIPE agenda, and we may, if it works for us, possibly have a conversation about that sort of draft paper. I'll confirm that by email as and when it's firmed up and in the diary. And Kurt, good to know you're going to be in Lisbon, so perhaps we can meet up in person. Well done for being a non-com member. Thank you for volunteering to do that. An important role. Okay, that's it from me. It's we're on the hour. Anyone had anything you instantly wanted to mention? Quickly unmute and say it before I close the call, or pop it in the chat and I can share it afterwards. But if not, doesn't look like there is. So thank you, Emily, for an excellent presentation. As always, much appreciated. I'm sure that will give plenty of food for thought for people to reflect on the importance of NIS2. And otherwise, thank you everyone for your time. Appreciate it. Remember, we're not meeting next week. Enjoy Easter Monday if that's your thing, and we'll catch up in 2 weeks' time. So look forward to speaking to you all then. Have a great week, everyone. See you in a couple of weeks. Bye.